In the winter of 1961, inside a crowded reception room at the United Nations headquarters in New York City, a Soviet military intelligence officer approached an American diplomat and, in a conversation that lasted less than 90 seconds, initiated what would become the longest running and most consequential espionage operation of the Cold War. The Soviet officer's name was Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov. He was 40 years old, a colonel in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and held the position of assistant air attaché at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. His diplomatic credentials gave him legitimate reasons to attend international gatherings, meet with foreign officials, and travel within the United States. His actual assignment, according to later declassified CIA assessments, was to identify and recruit Americans with access to classified information who might be willing to provide intelligence to the Soviet Union. What the KGB and GRU leadership did not know, what they would not discover for more than 2 decades, was that Dmitry Polyakov had already made a decision that would define the rest of his life and ultimately lead to his execution. He had decided to betray the Soviet Union and offer his services to American intelligence. The American diplomat Polyakov approached that afternoon was a mid-level State Department officer attending the reception in his official capacity. According to declassified CIA documents, Polyakov's approach was careful and indirect. He did not immediately identify himself as a potential intelligence source. Instead, he engaged in what appeared to be ordinary diplomatic small talk, discussing cultural exchanges and expressing interest in American perspectives on international affairs. But within that brief conversation, Polyakov managed to communicate something more significant, a willingness to meet again in a less public setting to discuss matters of mutual interest. The State Department officer, trained to recognize potential recruitment approaches, understood what was being suggested. He reported the contact to the CIA's New York station that same evening. Within 48 hours, arrangements were made for a second meeting, this one at a safe house in Manhattan, away from the scrutiny of Soviet intelligence officers who routinely monitored the movements of their own personnel. Before we follow how this single decision would lead to nearly 25 years of espionage, betrayal, and ultimately execution, if you're fascinated by the documented truth behind Cold War intelligence operations and the real human cost of espionage, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these deeply researched cases every week, bringing you the factual details behind some of history's most significant intelligence operations. Now, let's understand how a decorated Soviet general became one of America's most valuable intelligence sources and how that decision would destroy him and his family. Dmitry Polyakov had been born in 1921 in Ryazan Oblast, a rural region southeast of Moscow. His father had been a veterinarian who worked with collective farms during the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s. His mother had been a schoolteacher. According to biographical information Polyakov later provided to his CIA handlers, his childhood had been marked by the hardships that characterized rural Soviet life during that period: food shortages, harsh winters, the constant presence of state authority, and the paranoia that accompanied Stalin's purges. Polyakov had been 16 years old when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. He had volunteered for military service and had been assigned to an artillery unit. He had fought in several major battles, including the defense of Moscow and later operations in Ukraine. He had been wounded twice, once by shrapnel and once by a gunshot wound to his left shoulder. He had been decorated for bravery and had been promoted to junior officer rank before the war's end. After the war, Polyakov had attended the Frunze Military Academy, the Soviet Union's premier institution for training military officers. He had shown particular aptitude for languages, mastering English and developing working proficiency in Chinese. In 1951, he had been recruited into the GRU, where his language skills, military experience, and analytical abilities made him valuable for foreign intelligence operations. Polyakov's first overseas assignment had been to Rangoon, Burma, where he had served under diplomatic cover from 1952 to 1956. His second posting had been to New Delhi, India, from 1958 to 1961. In both locations, he had operated as a case officer, attempting to recruit local nationals who might provide intelligence on Western military activities and regional political developments. By 1961, when he was assigned to New York, Polyakov had established a solid reputation within the GRU as a competent, reliable officer with a promising career ahead of him. On a Wednesday morning in March 1964, Dmitri Polyakov arrived at GRU headquarters on Khoroshevskoye Highway in northwestern Moscow at his customary time of 8:15 a.m. He had returned to Moscow from his New York posting 6 months earlier and had been assigned to the GRU's First Directorate, responsible for intelligence operations in the United States and Western Europe. His office was on the fourth floor of the main building, a room he shared with two other colonels of similar rank. The office contained 3 desks, filing cabinets filled with operational cables and personnel files, and a large map of NATO countries mounted on one wall. Polyakov hung his heavy winter coat on a hook near the door, greeted his office mates with the standard morning pleasantries, and settled at his desk. On his calendar for that day were a briefing on GRU recruitment operations targeting American military personnel in West Germany, a meeting to review intelligence requirements for Soviet military planners, and routine paperwork related to personnel evaluations for junior officers serving overseas. To his colleagues, Polyakov appeared entirely ordinary that morning, a career intelligence officer, methodical and professional, working his way through the bureaucratic demands of headquarters duty. What they could not have known was that hidden in Polyakov's briefcase, beneath routine documents and a copy of Pravda, was a Minox subminiature camera provided by the CIA. What they could not have seen was that during his lunch break, Polyakov would lock himself in a bathroom stall and photograph 12 pages of classified documents describing GRU assessment of NATO force readiness. What they could not have imagined was that within a week, those photographs would be developed at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and would be briefed to American military commanders responsible for defending Western Europe. Polyakov's double life had become routine. He had been providing intelligence to the United States for nearly 3 years. He had survived the transition from operating in New York, where meetings with CIA handlers had been possible, to operating from Moscow, where every movement was potentially subject to KGB surveillance. He had developed the psychological compartmentalization necessary to betray his service every day while appearing completely loyal, and he had accepted that this double existence would continue for as long as he could maintain it without being caught. At the second meeting in the Manhattan Safe House in late January 1961, Polyakov was met by 2 CIA officers. One introduced himself only as Richard. His actual name has never been declassified. The other was a technical specialist responsible for communication protocols and security procedures. The meeting lasted approximately 3 hours. Polyakov made clear that he was not seeking to defect. He did not want to leave the Soviet Union, abandon his family, or live in exile in the West. What he wanted was to remain in place, continue his career within the GRU, and provide intelligence to the United States for as long as he could do so without being caught. This type of asset, an intelligence officer operating from within a hostile service, is known as a penetration agent, or mole. Such agents are extraordinarily valuable because they have direct access to their own service's secrets, operational plans, the identities of other intelligence officers and their agents, technical capabilities, and strategic intentions. The CIA officers explained the reality he would face. Operating as a penetration agent within Soviet military intelligence was among the most dangerous forms of espionage imaginable. The KGB and GRU both maintained aggressive counterintelligence operations designed to identify traitors within their own ranks. If Polyakov were discovered, the consequences would be execution, not imprisonment, but death, probably after months of interrogation. His family would also suffer. His wife and children could be arrested, exiled to remote regions, denied education and employment opportunities, and subjected to constant surveillance and harassment. Polyakov stated that he understood the risks and was willing to accept them. According to debriefing records from those early meetings, he articulated his motivations with clarity that his handlers found both compelling and troubling. He expressed deep disillusionment with the Soviet system, not with socialism as an abstract ideal, but with the reality of how the Soviet state functioned. He had witnessed the brutality of Stalin's regime, the corruption and incompetence of the bureaucracy, the gap between propaganda and reality, and the suffering imposed on ordinary Soviet citizens by their own government. He had served in India and Burma and had seen how citizens of other nations, including Western democracies, lived with greater freedom and prosperity than Soviet citizens enjoyed. He had come to believe that the Soviet system was fundamentally broken and that the military and intelligence apparatus he served was perpetuating oppression rather than defending the people. Polyakov also stated that he was motivated by a desire to prevent nuclear war. By the early 1960s, the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached dangerous levels. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, months after Polyakov's initial recruitment, would bring the world closer to nuclear catastrophe than it had ever been. Polyakov believed that providing the United States with accurate intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and intentions could reduce the risk of miscalculation and prevent a war that would destroy both nations and much of the world. Polyakov was assigned the cryptonym TOPHAT by the CIA's Soviet division. Later, after a reorganization of code names, he would also be known as BOURBON. Communication protocols were established. Given Polyakov's position at the Soviet mission to the United Nations, direct meetings in New York were possible, though they would need to be carefully managed to avoid detection by Soviet counterintelligence. Dead drops, concealed locations where Polyakov could leave materials for CIA retrieval without face-to-face contact, were identified at several locations in the New York area. The information Polyakov provided during that first operational meeting was significant enough to convince the CIA that he was genuine and not a dangle, a false defector sent by Soviet intelligence to feed disinformation or identify CIA officers and methods. Polyakov provided details about GRU operations in New York, including the identities of other Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, the targeting priorities for GRU recruitment efforts, and specific approaches that had been made to American citizens who worked at defense contractors or government agencies. Over the following months, as the CIA-Polyakov relationship developed, the value of his intelligence became increasingly clear. Polyakov had access to GRU operational cables, personnel files, and strategic assessments. He photographed documents using a miniature camera provided by the CIA. He memorized information that was too sensitive to be removed from secure facilities. He provided detailed briefings during clandestine meetings with his handlers. By late 1962, Polyakov had provided intelligence that contributed to the identification and arrest of several Soviet agents operating in the United States and Europe. He had also provided advance warning of certain Soviet intelligence operations, allowing the FBI and CIA to monitor those operations and, in some cases, to turn them to American advantage by feeding disinformation back through the compromised channels. In 1963, Polyakov's tour in New York ended, and he was recalled to Moscow. For the CIA, this created both challenges and opportunities. The challenge was that Polyakov would no longer be easily accessible for meetings in New York. The opportunity was that Polyakov, upon his return to Moscow, would be assigned to GRU headquarters, the center of Soviet military intelligence operations, where he would have access to even more valuable information. The CIA and Polyakov worked out new communication protocols before his departure. These included dead drops in Moscow, concealed locations where Polyakov could leave photographed documents or written reports, and where CIA officers operating under diplomatic cover at the U.S. Embassy could retrieve them. The procedures were elaborate and designed with multiple layers of security to minimize the risk of detection, A typical operation from Polyakov's years working from GRU headquarters in Moscow proceeded as follows. On a cold afternoon in November 1975, at approximately 2:45 p.m., Dmitri Polyakov left GRU headquarters on Khoroshevskoye Highway, informing his aide that he was attending a routine meeting at the Ministry of Defense. He drove his government-issued Volga sedan through Moscow's early winter afternoon, the sky already darkening toward the 4 p.m. sunset that came to the city at that latitude in late autumn. His actual destination was Sokolniki Park, a large wooded area in northeastern Moscow, popular with families, elderly pensioners taking afternoon walks, and young couples seeking privacy. The park covered more than 600 hectares and included both manicured gardens and dense forest. It was one of several locations Polyakov and his CIA handlers had designated for dead drop operations. Polyakov parked his car in a lot near the park's southern entrance. He had with him a briefcase containing ostensibly routine paperwork, reports, and memoranda that would explain his presence outside GRU headquarters if he were questioned. But inside a false compartment in the briefcase were 2 rolls of microfilm containing photographed pages of classified GRU documents about Soviet military assessments of NATO force deployments in Western Europe. Before entering the park, Polyakov executed standard counter-surveillance procedures. He walked past the park entrance, continued down the street for 2 blocks, stopped at a kiosk to purchase a newspaper, and used the opportunity to check whether anyone was following him. He saw nothing suspicious, no unfamiliar faces, no vehicles that appeared to be maintaining pace with him, no indication that KGB surveillance teams were monitoring his movements. Satisfied that he was not being followed, Polyakov entered the park and began walking along one of the main paths. The park was relatively crowded despite the cold weather, mothers with children bundled against the chill, old men walking slowly with canes, teenagers smoking cigarettes away from adult supervision. Polyakov's presence attracted no attention. He was a middle-aged man in a heavy coat and fur hat, looking like any other Muscovite taking an afternoon walk. After walking for approximately 15 minutes, Polyakov turned onto a smaller trail that led into a wooded section of the park. The number of people diminished as he moved away from the main paths. He passed a frozen pond where a few hardy souls were ice skating. He continued into denser forest where birch and pine trees blocked the fading afternoon light. The dead drop location was a specific tree, a birch with a distinctive double trunk approximately 30 meters off the trail. Polyakov and his CIA handlers had selected this location months earlier because it was isolated enough to provide privacy, but not so isolated that visiting it would appear suspicious. A person walking in this part of the park could plausibly be taking a shortcut, looking for a quiet spot to sit, or simply exploring. Polyakov approached the tree, stopped, and pretended to tie his shoe. While crouched down, he removed the 2 microfilm rolls from his briefcase, placed them inside a waterproof metal container, roughly the size of a cigarette pack, and pushed the container into a hollow at the base of the double trunk, where the 2 trunks separated. He covered the container with fallen leaves and a piece of bark. The entire operation, from approaching the tree to concealing the container, took less than 30 seconds. To any casual observer, Polyakov had simply stopped to tie his shoe before continuing his walk. He stood, returned to the trail, and walked back toward the park entrance by a different route than he had used coming in. Before leaving the park, Polyakov made a signal that would inform his CIA handlers that he had loaded the dead drop. The signal was a chalk mark, a simple horizontal line drawn on a specific lamppost near the park's entrance. To anyone who noticed it, the chalk mark would appear to be meaningless graffiti. But to CIA officers watching for it, the mark indicated that Polyakov had placed material at the dead drop site and that they should retrieve it. 2 days later, on a rainy afternoon that provided excellent conditions for clandestine operations, a CIA officer working under diplomatic cover at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow entered Sokolniki Park. His route and timing had been carefully planned to avoid patterns that might attract KGB surveillance. He walked the same trail Polyakov had walked, approached the same double-trunked birch tree, crouched as if to examine something on the ground, and retrieved the metal container from its hiding place. He placed the container in his coat pocket, stood, and walked back toward the park entrance. The microfilm was smuggled out of the Soviet Union through diplomatic channels and was developed at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The documents Polyakov had photographed provided detailed insights into Soviet military planning and confirmed intelligence from other sources about Soviet conventional force strengths in Eastern Europe. From start to finish, from Polyakov's decision to photograph the documents at GRU headquarters to CIA analysts reading those documents in Virginia, the operation had taken approximately 1 week and had involved multiple people risking imprisonment or death. And this was just one operation among dozens that Polyakov conducted throughout his career as a CIA source. Between 1963 and 1966, Polyakov operated from within GRU headquarters in Moscow, providing what CIA assessments would later describe as intelligence of extraordinary value. He photographed hundreds of pages of classified documents. He provided organizational charts showing the structure of Soviet military intelligence. He identified GRU officers serving overseas and described their operational assignments. He provided technical intelligence on Soviet weapon systems, military doctrine, and strategic planning. One particularly significant category of intelligence, Polyakov provided concerned Soviet efforts to collect information on American nuclear weapons, delivery systems, and command and control procedures. By understanding what the Soviets were trying to learn, American intelligence and military planners could better protect sensitive information and, when strategically useful, could feed carefully crafted disinformation through channels the Soviets believed were secure, but which had actually been compromised. Polyakov also provided information that helped the United States understand Soviet military capabilities and intentions in various regional conflicts. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union was providing military assistance to North Vietnam in its war against South Vietnam and the United States. Polyakov's intelligence helped American military planners understand the types and quantities of weapons being supplied, the training being provided to North Vietnamese forces, and Soviet assessments of the war's progress. In 1966, Polyakov was assigned to a new overseas posting, Rangoon, Burma, where he had served earlier in his career. He served there as a senior GRU officer until 1969. During this period, he maintained contact with the CIA through a combination of dead drops, brief personal meetings with CIA officers who traveled to Rangoon undercover, and coded communications sent through seemingly innocent channels. The intelligence Polyakov provided from Burma included information on Soviet efforts to expand influence in Southeast Asia, on Chinese military activities along the Sino-Burmese border, and on the deepening split between the Soviet Union and China. By the late 1960s, the relationship between the two communist powers had deteriorated into open hostility, with border clashes and mutual accusations of betraying Marxist-Leninist principles. Polyakov provided detailed reporting on how Soviet military intelligence assessed the Chinese threat and what preparations were being made for a possible conflict. In 1969, Polyakov returned to Moscow and was promoted to the rank of general, a significant achievement within the Soviet military intelligence system. His promotion gave him access to even more sensitive information and brought him into closer contact with the GRU's senior leadership. He was assigned to the GRU's Third Directorate, which was responsible for military intelligence operations in Asia. From 1970 to 1974, Polyakov continued to provide high-level intelligence from his position at GRU headquarters. According to declassified CIA documents, the information he provided during this period included early warning of Soviet military exercises that could have been misinterpreted by Western intelligence as preparations for an attack, details on Soviet weapons development programs, and information on recruitment operations targeting Western military and intelligence personnel. In 1974, Polyakov was assigned to New Delhi, India, as a GRU resident, the chief of Soviet military intelligence operations in the country. This was a prestigious assignment that reflected the GRU leadership's confidence in Polyakov's abilities and loyalty. It also placed him in a location where he could more easily meet with CIA handlers who could travel to India without arousing suspicion. During his assignment in New Delhi from 1974 to 1980, Polyakov continued his espionage activities with remarkable productivity. He provided intelligence on Soviet relations with India, on weapons sales and military assistance programs, on GRU efforts to recruit Indian government officials and military officers, and on Soviet assessments of regional security issues, including the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan. The CIA's relationship with Polyakov had, by this point, lasted nearly 2 decades. He had survived multiple counterintelligence scares within the GRU. He had been promoted repeatedly, demonstrating that he remained above suspicion within his own service. The intelligence he had provided had contributed to numerous successful American operations and had given U.S. policymakers insights into Soviet thinking and capabilities that would have been impossible to obtain through any other means. But by the late 1970s, cracks were beginning to appear in American intelligence security, cracks that would eventually expose Dmitri Polyakov and lead to his death. In 1979, a CIA officer named Edward Lee Howard was hired by the agency and began training for assignment to the CIA's Moscow station. Howard would have had access to information about intelligence operations in the Soviet Union, potentially including information about high-level sources. In 1983, Howard failed a polygraph examination during a routine security review and was fired from the CIA. In September 1985, facing possible criminal charges, Howard defected to the Soviet Union. Before his defection, and possibly after, he provided information to the KGB about CIA operations in Moscow. But the two most devastating penetrations of American intelligence, the ones that would ultimately expose Dmitri Polyakov, were carried out by Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen. Aldrich Hazen Ames had joined the CIA in 1962, the same year Polyakov had made his initial approach to American intelligence. Ames had worked in various positions within the CIA's Directorate of Operations, which was responsible for clandestine intelligence collection. By the early 1980s, Ames was working in the CIA's Soviet East European Division, with access to information about the agency's most sensitive operations and sources within the Soviet Union. Ames's career had been undistinguished. His performance evaluations were mediocre, and his personal life was troubled. He drank heavily. His first marriage had ended in divorce, and he was living beyond his means. In 1983, he married a Colombian woman named Rosario Casas Dupuy, whose expensive tastes further strained his finances. By early 1985, Ames was deeply in debt and desperate for money. Robert Philip Hanssen's betrayal would run parallel to Ames's, though the two men did not know each other and were working for different American intelligence agencies. Hanssen was an FBI agent who had joined the Bureau in 1976. He had been assigned to counterintelligence work and had developed expertise in Soviet intelligence operations. By 1985, Hanssen had access to sensitive FBI and CIA information about operations targeting the Soviet Union. What happened next would become known within the CIA as the Year of the Spy. On April 16, 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and volunteered to work as a spy for the KGB. His initial motivation was purely financial. He wanted money to pay his debts and maintain the lifestyle his wife expected. In exchange for $50,000, Ames provided the KGB with the names of several Soviet citizens who were cooperating with the CIA. On June 13, 1985, Ames met with his KGB handler at a restaurant in Washington and handed over a package containing documents that identified virtually every significant CIA source within the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The list included more than 20 names, among them some of the most valuable intelligence sources the United States had ever recruited. Dmitri Polyakov's identity was on that list. In October 1985, Robert Hanssen approached the KGB and offered to provide classified information. Unlike Ames, who met directly with KGB handlers, Hanssen insisted on maintaining anonymity. He communicated through dead drops and coded letters, never revealing his true identity to his Soviet contacts. Over the following years, Hanssen provided thousands of pages of classified documents that compromised numerous American intelligence operations and exposed multiple sources, including Dmitri Polyakov. The information Ames and Hanssen provided to Soviet intelligence in 1985 triggered a catastrophe for American intelligence operations. Between May and December 1985, the KGB began arresting CIA sources throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The arrests happened rapidly, over a period of just a few months, though the KGB deliberately staggered them to avoid making it obvious that a major security breach had occurred. Among those the KGB now knew about was Dmitri Polyakov, but his arrest would not come immediately. Polyakov had returned to Moscow from his assignment in New Delhi in 1980 and had been assigned to a senior position at GRU headquarters. He had continued to provide intelligence to the CIA through dead drops and other clandestine means. By 1985, he was approaching retirement age. He had served American intelligence for nearly 25 years without being caught. On a morning in July 1986, the exact date remains classified in Russian archives, KGB counterintelligence officers arrived at Polyakov's apartment in Moscow at approximately 6:30 a.m. He was 65 years old, a new general approaching retirement, living in a building reserved for senior military officers in the Koroshyovsky district of northwestern Moscow. According to accounts later provided by former KGB personnel who defected to the West, Polyakov was at home when the arrest team arrived. His wife answered the door. The KGB officers, wearing civilian clothes but carrying official identification, presented her with an arrest warrant. The charge was high treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. Polyakov was in the kitchen, drinking tea and reading Pravda. When the KGB officers entered, he looked up but did not appear surprised. One officer would later describe his reaction as resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. He asked to dress properly before being taken into custody. The request was granted, and he changed from his morning clothes into his GRU uniform, putting on his decorations, medals from the Great Patriotic War, service ribbons from his overseas postings, the insignia of his rank. The search of Polyakov's apartment lasted approximately 3 hours. KGB officers photographed every room, examined every piece of paper, opened every book. They found nothing obviously incriminating, no spy equipment, no classified documents, no large sums of foreign currency. Polyakov had been too careful, too professional, to keep evidence in his home, but the KGB didn't need to find evidence in his apartment. They had evidence provided by Aldrich Ames, dates, locations, contents of intelligence reports Polyakov had provided, details that only someone with access to CIA files could have known. Polyakov was transported to Lefortovo prison in an unmarked van. His wife was told she would be contacted by authorities regarding further questioning. She would be interrogated repeatedly over the following weeks to determine whether she had known about her husband's espionage activities. By mid-morning on the day of his arrest, Polyakov was in an interrogation room at Lefortovo, facing KGB officers who already knew everything he had done. Lefortovo prison, built in the late 19th century, was notorious for its harsh conditions and for the interrogations conducted there. The facility was operated by the KGB and was used primarily for holding political prisoners and accused spies. Cells were small, cold in winter and stifling in summer. Prisoners were kept in isolation, denied contact with family members, and subjected to intensive interrogation sessions that could last for hours. According to accounts from former KGB personnel, Polyakov initially denied the accusations against him. He claimed that he was being framed, that the evidence was fabricated, that he had always been loyal to the Soviet Union. But the KGB interrogators had detailed information about his activities, dates of meetings, locations of dead drops, copies of documents he had photographed, descriptions of his CIA handlers. The information had come from Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen, though Polyakov would never have known the identities of the men who had betrayed him. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Polyakov eventually acknowledged his espionage activities, In interrogation sessions that lasted for months, he was questioned about what information he had provided, what his motivations had been, and whether other GRU officers had been involved. KGB counterintelligence officers wanted to understand how Polyakov had evaded detection for so long and whether there were weaknesses in their security procedures that needed to be addressed. According to later accounts, Polyakov refused to express remorse for his actions. He maintained that he had acted according to his conscience, that he had believed the Soviet system was fundamentally corrupt, and that providing intelligence to the United States had been his way of trying to prevent a catastrophic war and to undermine a government he believed was oppressing its own people. The legal proceedings against Polyakov were conducted in secret. Under Soviet law, espionage cases involving military or intelligence personnel were handled by military tribunals, not civilian courts. Defendants in such cases had minimal legal protections. The proceedings were closed to the public and to family members. The accused had limited ability to present a defense or to call witnesses. Polyakov was convicted of high treason and espionage. The sentence was death by execution. On March 15, 1988, Dmitri Fyodorovich Polyakov was executed by firing squad at a facility outside Moscow. He was 66 years old. The Soviet government did not publicly announce Polyakov's arrest, trial, or execution. The first indication that Western intelligence agencies had that Polyakov had been compromised came from the sudden cessation of contact in 1986. When dead drops went unserviced and signals went unanswered, the CIA assumed the worst. Confirmation of Polyakov's death did not come until 1990, when the former KGB officer Viktor Cherkashin, in interviews with Western journalists following the collapse of the Soviet Union, confirmed that Polyakov had been arrested, tried, and executed. For Polyakov's family, the consequences of his arrest and execution were immediate and severe. Under Soviet law and practice, the families of convicted traitors were subject to punishment, even if they had no knowledge of the person's crimes. Polyakov's wife was interrogated extensively by the KGB to determine whether she had known about her husband's espionage activities. The interrogators concluded that she had not known, but this did not spare her from consequences. She was evicted from the apartment where she and Dmitri had lived. She lost the pension and benefits she had been entitled to as the wife of a GRU general. She was effectively unemployable because of her husband's conviction. According to later accounts from people who knew the family, she lived in poverty for the remaining years of her life, supported by relatives who were willing to risk the stigma of association with the traitor's family. Polyakov's children, the exact number and details remain undocumented in declassified sources, were also subjected to severe consequences. Those who had been working in professional positions lost their jobs. Family members pursuing careers in government service, academia, or technical fields were expelled from their positions and blacklisted from employment in their chosen fields. The children were also subjected to intensive interrogation by the KGB. The interrogators wanted to determine whether they had ever suspected their father's activities, whether he had ever said anything that might have indicated disloyalty to the Soviet Union, and whether they themselves might be security risks. The interrogations were psychologically brutal, designed to break down the subjects and extract any potentially relevant information. According to accounts from people who knew the family in later years, Polyakov's children struggled to understand what their father had done and why. They had been raised to believe in Soviet values, to respect the state, and to take pride in their father's military service. Learning that he had been spying for the United States was psychologically devastating. They lived under constant surveillance for years after their father's execution, never knowing whether they might be arrested on manufactured charges or simply whether they would be allowed to rebuild their lives. The impact of Polyakov's exposure and death on American intelligence was profound. He had been one of the most valuable sources the CIA had ever recruited. Former CIA Director James Woolsey, speaking publicly after Polyakov's execution became known, described him as probably the best source the U.S. ever had inside the Soviet Union's military intelligence service. The intelligence Polyakov had provided over more than 2 decades had shaped American understanding of Soviet military capabilities, intentions, and vulnerabilities. In the years that followed, the full scope of the damage caused by Ames and Hanssen became clear. The information they had provided had led directly to the arrests and executions of multiple human sources. Not only had valuable sources been compromised, but the methods and procedures used to communicate with those sources had been exposed, requiring entire systems to be rebuilt. Perhaps most damaging was the message the arrests sent to potential sources within the Soviet Union that the United States could not protect the people who risked their lives to provide intelligence. For the CIA officers who had worked with Polyakov and who had assured him that the agency would protect him, the knowledge that their own colleagues had betrayed him was devastating. Several former case officers have spoken publicly about their sense of guilt and failure, acknowledging that while they could not have known about Ames or Hanssen, they had made a promise to Polyakov that the United States had ultimately been unable to keep. Aldrich Ames was finally arrested in February 1994, nearly 9 years after he had begun spying for the Soviet Union. His arrest came after a lengthy counterintelligence investigation that had been triggered by the 1985-1986 arrests of CIA sources in the Soviet Union. Investigators had eventually focused on Ames after analyzing his financial records, his overseas travel, and his access to information about the compromised operations. Ames pleaded guilty to espionage charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. In exchange for his cooperation, he ultimately received approximately $4.6 million from the KGB and its successor agency, the SVR. Robert Hanssen's betrayal continued even longer. He was not arrested until February 2001, more than 15 years after he had begun spying for the Soviet Union and later for Russia. His arrest came after the FBI obtained a copy of a file the KGB had maintained on their anonymous source, which allowed investigators to identify Hanssen through analysis of the documents he had provided and the writing style of his communications. Hanssen also pleaded guilty to espionage charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He had received approximately $1.4 million from Soviet and Russian intelligence over the course of his espionage career. The full scope of Dmitri Polyakov's contribution to American intelligence remained classified for many years after his death. As the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and as Russia emerged as a post-communist state, some information about Cold War espionage cases began to be declassified and released. In 1992, the CIA's internal journal, Studies in Intelligence, published an article describing the recruitment and production of a high-level source within Soviet military intelligence. The article, written by former CIA officers who had worked with Polyakov, praised his courage and his contribution to preventing nuclear war through the intelligence he provided about Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Former CIA case officers who had worked with Polyakov described him as a man of principle who had been motivated primarily by conviction rather than by money or ego. They emphasized that he had accepted enormous personal risk in order to act according to his conscience, and that he had maintained his commitment to his mission even as the dangers increased and even as he approached retirement age when he could have simply stopped and lived out his remaining years in safety. The question of whether Polyakov's espionage actually contributed to preventing nuclear war or reducing Cold War tensions is impossible to answer definitively. Intelligence is almost never the sole factor in major policy decisions, and the causal relationship between specific intelligence reports and specific policy outcomes is difficult to establish. However, CIA assessments concluded that Polyakov's intelligence had been valuable in several specific ways. His reporting on Soviet military capabilities and doctrine had helped American military planners understand what the Soviet Union could actually do, as opposed to what propaganda claimed it could do. This understanding reduced the risk of both overestimation and underestimation, both of which could lead to poor strategic decisions. Polyakov's intelligence about internal Soviet assessments of the arms race and of regional conflicts had given American policymakers insights into how Soviet leaders actually viewed the competition between the two superpowers. His information about Soviet intelligence operations had allowed the FBI and CIA to identify and neutralize Soviet espionage activities in the United States and allied countries, reducing the Soviet Union's ability to steal American military and technological secrets. In 2001, a memorial was dedicated at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, honoring intelligence sources who had been betrayed and killed. The memorial includes recognition of sources who gave their lives in service of American intelligence operations. The memorial serves as a reminder that intelligence operations involve real human beings who make choices with life or death consequences. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Polyakov's name gradually became known in Russia as well as in the West. Some Russians viewed him as a traitor who had betrayed his country. Others saw him as a man of conscience who had tried to prevent nuclear war and to undermine a system he believed was morally corrupt. The debate over his legacy reflects broader debates within post-Soviet Russia about the nature of the Soviet period and about what loyalty and patriotism actually mean. For Polyakov's family, the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union brought some measure of rehabilitation. The Russian government did not formally exonerate Polyakov. He had, after all, committed espionage against his own country, but the stigma associated with the being a traitor's family gradually diminished as Russian society became more open and as the Cold War receded into history. Polyakov's wife died in the late 1990s, approximately a decade after her husband's execution. She had lived long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse, though she never spoke publicly about her husband or about her own experiences during and after his arrest. The reforms implemented after the Ames and Hanssen cases included enhanced security procedures, more rigorous counterintelligence monitoring of personnel with access to sensitive information, better coordination between intelligence agencies, and new technologies for detecting anomalous behavior. But these reforms came too late for Dmitri Polyakov and the other sources who had been compromised. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires us to assign accountability among individuals who were all to some degree acting according to the logic of the systems they inhabited. Polyakov made choices. He chose to engage with CIA recruiters. He chose to provide classified information. He chose to maintain the relationship for nearly 25 years. He chose to continue even as the risks accumulated, and even as he could have stopped. Those choices were his, and he bore responsibility for them. But he made those choices in a world divided by Cold War tensions, in a society that he had come to believe was fundamentally corrupt, in an intelligence environment where Soviet and American agencies competed to recruit assets and collect information. Those systemic factors did not cause his choices, but they created the conditions in which those choices became possible, and, from his perspective at the time, necessary. The Polyakov children bear no responsibility for any of this. They were family members who had no knowledge of their father's activities, who were traumatized by his arrest and its aftermath, and who spent years dealing with consequences they did not deserve. Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB officer who helped conduct the damage assessment after Polyakov's arrest, later wrote that the case had been a wake-up call for Soviet counterintelligence. The GRU had failed to detect Polyakov despite multiple opportunities. His overseas assignments, his access to classified information, his travel patterns, and his contacts with foreigners should all have subjected him to intensive security scrutiny. But the assumption that a decorated war veteran and senior general would never betray his country had created a blind spot that Polyakov had exploited for more than 2 decades. The technical information that Polyakov provided to American intelligence between the early 1960s and 1986 shaped strategic decisions during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. Whether his espionage actually affected specific military or strategic outcomes is impossible to determine with certainty. Intelligence operations by their nature involve the accumulation of many small pieces of information that are assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. It is possible that information from Polyakov influenced Soviet military planning or American strategic decisions. It is also possible that some of the information was received, analyzed, and ultimately had less practical impact than either Polyakov or his handlers believed it would. What the documented record shows is the human cost, not just to Polyakov himself, but to his family. His wife spent more than a decade dealing with the aftermath of her husband's choices, including the financial hardship, the social stigma, and the challenge of surviving in a society that viewed her family as traitors. His children grew up in the shadow of their father's conviction, dealing with shame, confusion, and the loss of a parent, not to death in any ordinary sense, but to execution for crimes they struggled to understand. Dmitri Polyakov was 40 years old when he first approached American intelligence in the winter of 1961. He was 65 when he was arrested in 1986. He was 66 when he was executed in 1988. In the nearly 25 years between his recruitment and his arrest, he provided intelligence that shaped American understanding of the Soviet military, influenced strategic decisions, and contributed to operations that may have prevented miscalculations during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. He also destroyed his own life and damaged the lives of his wife and children, who bore consequences for choices they had not made and for actions they had not known about. Whether the intelligence he provided justified those costs, whether his espionage actually contributed to preventing nuclear war, and whether his betrayal of the Soviet Union was an act of conscience or an act of treason, are questions that cannot be answered objectively because they depend on values and perspectives that differ fundamentally. What remains is the fact of his life, his choices, and his death. He chose to betray the service he had dedicated his life to because he believed the cause he was serving was fundamentally wrong. He maintained that betrayal for nearly 25 years despite the constant danger. He was caught because other Americans, serving the same intelligence agencies Polyakov was helping, betrayed him for money and ego, and he died believing, according to those who interrogated him, that he had acted rightly even though he had lost everything.